Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Andy Forsythe and I am the Assistant Library Manager. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Ridgefield Library. Thank you for being here this morning for the annual Meet Your Legislators program, offered in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield. And just a couple of housekeeping announcements. If for any reason we have to exit this room very quickly, just head right out those doors to the terrace and all will be good. And I would like to mention wireless microphone number 3, which is Aimee's mic, sometimes does a little bit of feedback. So Aimee, if it starts to be a problem, if you don't mind turning off your mic, that's the culprit. We are so pleased to have all of Ridgefield's state legislators here this morning. And here to introduce them and tell you a little more about the program this morning is the president of the League, Marilyn Carroll. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. You're probably getting sick of my face, but I'm delighted to see you all, especially on such a cold morning. And as Andy said, I am Marilyn Carroll, the very proud president of the League of Women Voters of Ridgefield. And thank you again for joining us. I especially like to thank the library for co-sponsoring and hosting this program. The League and the library presents this program every year so that our elected legislators can let us know what is happening in the current legislative session in Hartford and discuss the bills before them that are of particular interest to us all. So again, thank you all for coming. Before I turn this meeting over to Mrs. Lynda Hanley, our program co-chair who has moderated this meeting so professional for so many years, I'd like to thank her for her years of service to the League. Mrs. Hanley has told us that this is going to be her last year moderating this meeting, so we just wanted her to know how much we appreciate everything you have done for us, and the shoes that you're going to have to be filled are going to have to be very large. Finally, for those of you who don't know it, March, which is coming right up, is Women's History Month. And we'd like to encourage you to join the library and their partner, the Ridgefield Historical Society, for a truly inspiring program on Sunday, March 5th at 2 p.m. with Kimberly Wilson, the award-winning creator and actor of A Journey, a musical one-woman show. The League is thrilled and honored to co-host this program, and you can find more information about it and register for it on the library's website. Now, without further delay, here is our moderator, Mrs. Lynda Hanley, who will explain how this session will proceed, introduce our legislators, and ask the questions that have been submitted by the League. She will then invite the community members to ask their questions. And this program will end sharply at 11:30, so we ask that you keep your very civil and respectful questions as short as possible and to the point, and ask our legislators to do the same when answering those questions, so that everyone who has a question can have an opportunity to ask it. And thank you to our legislators and to our members of the audience. Mrs. Hanley.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming on this. I see some snow flurries, which I hoped wouldn't be falling this morning. But I have been talking to my friends in Minneapolis this week, and this isn't so bad as what they've gone through this winter in the upper Midwest. So welcome to you all. Welcome to our legislators. Starting at my immediate left, State Senator Julie Kushner from the 24th District, which is the northern half of Ridgefield, and then State Senator Ceci Maher from District 26, which is the southern part of Ridgefield, State Representative Aimee Berger-Girvalo, who's Representative 111 from our representative district, and Keith Denning is the representative from the little corner, the southwest corner of Ridgefield, House District number 42. So if you haven't met them all, these are our state legislators. I thank you very much for coming this morning. And what I am going to do is start out, and because we're ending at 11:30, I'm going to start out and ask a couple of the League questions. And the League of Women Voters of Connecticut does this at the beginning of every legislative session when they ask their local leagues to have these Meet Your Legislator events, so that the people of Ridgefield can have an opportunity to hear what the League is advocating for this coming year and to ask your questions of the legislators. So what I'm going to do is, since we're stopping at 11:30, is I'm going to ask a couple League questions, And then I'm going to, before I finish, I'm going to open the floor to you who might have questions so that I don't take up all of the time that we have this morning. So that's what we're going to proceed to do. The lead questions are going to pertain to election laws, climate change, gun control, and housing. I'm starting out with the election laws questions. This is protect and expand voters' rights and access. Early voting. Do you support an implementation timeframe that ensures availability of early voting for the November 2023 elections? And the second question is, what parameters do you support for early voting? And the Government Administration and Elections Committee of the state legislature this past Wednesday did hold a public hearing, and there was a great deal of testimony from, it started out with the Secretary of State and then other people. I think we went till the middle of the afternoon. So with those two questions, Senator Kushner, do you want to begin, please? Sure.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the league for holding this. It's wonderful to be here this morning. A little bit of PTSD because this is where I was sitting at that end when you did the debate, and that was a very intense night.
This is you're my friend.
Yeah. But I'm happy to be here. And in terms of the early voting, I am a big supporter of early voting. I believe that it really will help strengthen our democracy to have more people have access to the ballot. And clearly, the issue of how that will be framed is very important. I've read recently that there's a lot of leaning toward the 14-day advance early voting, which I support because I think it's really important to have a couple of weekends in there for people to be able to come and vote. I think that in terms of I know some of the procedural challenges. In fact, I think Ridgefield will have fewer than some of the larger cities that will have to support many more polling places. But at the same time, it is a huge change. I do think that ultimately we need to move to the no excuse absentee ballot voting. And I think that will happen hopefully in the next few years, because what we all experienced during COVID was a real chance to see how that would work. And it was clear that for most people that was the preferred method. And that did really increase the number of people that voted. And I think that's our ultimate goal, is to make sure that we get more people to vote.
There. We're going?
Yes.
Okay, good. So this is actually going to get really boring because everything that Julie just said, I agree with. As you may have read in the papers, the Secretary of the State suggested 10 days of early voting, but the conversation is a little bit all over the place right now, and we don't really know part of it. We just had the public hearing, so now after the public hearing, I've learned a lot about this. Someone takes notes on everything that is said and then provides that information, and then the legislators look at the information that was provided in the public hearing. And I had a conversation with, just as a point of interest, I had a conversation with someone at the Capitol who does a lot of work on drafting the legislation. And I asked, how often does public hearing testimony change legislation? And the response was about 40%, which is really important to know. I know I'm a little off topic here, but I agree with everything Julie said, so I'm just going to go here. It's important to know that about public hearings, because what you say in testimony or in submitted written statements really does impact the way legislators look at the laws that we're putting into place. So just, that's a point of order. I agree that there's a lot of issues around early voting that we need to address. The cost, how is that going to be funded? What's the impact on local towns and registrars of voters? But it's important because the electorate of Connecticut, they actually voted, 60% of the people in Connecticut voted for early voting. So it's not a question of if we're going to have early voting, it's a question of how are we going to have early voting. And as far as the referendum, on the getting a referendum on the ballot for no excuse absentee voting, I'm not sure we're going to get it this legislature. I'll turn to my more seasoned colleagues on that, but it's something I totally support.
figure if I've been told we're going to get feedback, I might as well avoid that since I get plenty of feedback in my own time. First of all, thank you very much, Lynda, for setting this up. And I want to thank you most particularly because of how difficult I was to schedule with an alternating custody weekend schedule. It becomes a little tricky, so I really appreciate your flexibility in waiting for me.
And you only hear from me one more time when I thank you for being here. Then the emails from me will.
Anyway, so I am on the GAE committee, Government Administration and Elections, and so I was able to sit through the hearing the other day. But prior to that, even before we got to reach out and ask our own registrars and town clerk for their input, they reached out to us, which is not something that I have heard from a lot of my colleagues. So I want to not only thank them, but I want to give them the proper credit that is due for being really proactive about this. So Wayne Flogel, who is here, he is our Republican Registrar of Voters. Cindy Bruno is our Democratic Registrar. And we've got Wendy, is it Gannon? Is that the middle part of Leonetti? Thank you. I always want to put a G in there, an extra G, who is our town clerk. They had this really productive meeting with us where we talked about what the very specific needs would be. And it was never what the specific needs would be if we do this or as a sort of condition for doing this. They're all very supportive and understand that 60% of the state has spoken and said that we want this, so we're going to move forward. And their primary concern, while of course cost is one of them because we don't want the municipalities to have to absorb this cost, their primary concern is when we do it, we want to do it right the first time. And I really appreciate that, and I was able to express that to our Secretary of State, who also proactively had spoken already to this trio from Ridgefield, and was able actually to speak on some of the conversation that she had with them. Of course, we've heard what her priorities are, and the 10-day is what she's looking for because it would at least cover 2 weekends. I, like my colleagues, would love to see 14 days, but what I want to make sure is that we are cognizant of what that does to the towns. So I also want to talk to you about, very briefly, you poor thing, because what are you going to say? So we're taking up a couple of concepts, and so SB 1064 and HB 5004 are the two bills if you want to look them up yourself. The range between those is 10 to 24 days. 24 days, I can feel the trembling from the back of the room. Secretary of State, as I said, suggests 10, which is my minimum, and I would imagine probably the same. Not that I'd like to speak for my colleagues, but also proposed was requiring larger towns and cities longer early voter hours and more than one location, but allowing for smaller municipalities like ours with fewer resources to have a little bit more flexibility. And as long as the result offers ample opportunity for everybody without a disproportionate stress placed on municipalities or disproportionately eliminating any group of people who need to get out there and vote and need this opportunity, we're all going to be okay.
Representative Dent.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, Lynda.
Yes, I did.
Okay. Yes, we are going to have early voting. I've listened to the Secretary of State, and she justifies the 10 days as a balance of 2 weekends and the cost of actually running the election. Most of the peers that I've talked to, as well as people in my district, have talked to 1 to 2 weeks with a variety of times, making sure that we allow evenings, times when people are off work so they can actually get to the polls. Most importantly for me is that if we're going to change our voting system, we have to be able to fund new voting machines throughout the state. That's a significant cost. I proposed a bill this year, as well as the governor, to look into doing ranked choice voting. And so if we're going to buy these new voting machines, we want to make sure that all the new voting machines can handle ranked choice voting for future elections. And so these are the things, whether we go 10 days or 14 days, will be done, and we will have early voting. But I want to make sure that we invest in the future of our voting machines so that we can continue for the next 20 years using equipment that will carry us on in future elections.
Thank you. And the follow-up question, under protect and expand voters' rights and access is, do you support an amendment to Article 6 of the state constitution to allow any qualified elector to, regardless of reason, cast an absentee ballot instead of appearing at a polling place on the day of an election? And we'll start with Representative Denning. So you're first up.
I'm just going to say yes. I mean, this is a no-brainer. The more people we can get to the polls safely, verifying their residency, the more people get their voice heard, the better we are as a people.
It's my thing. Don't be concerned about my ability to legislate by my inability to choose a microphone. So this is a major priority of the caucus. Yes, absolutely. And it is HJ1, House Joint Resolution 1, which we just voted to draft in GAE. You vote to draft, that means it's moving forward within the committee. And so you can see on record, I have already voted in favor of this on at least a very small scale.
Yes. I'm just going to move on because I already referenced it earlier. Sorry, I jumped ahead.
And as I already answered the question, yes, I'm in favor of it, but I also want to address the process question because I think that is a concern. I mean, hopefully we will get enough votes to be able to go to a referendum on it quickly. But as Senator Maher mentioned, it doesn't always happen that way. For instance, on the early voting, it got the necessary votes in the House, but it didn't get the necessary votes, the percentage in the Senate, so we ended up having to vote on it a second time. So that's the process. If you don't get a supermajority in the first time around, you have to vote on it a second term, legislative session, so it means you have to skip a year, depending on which year you voted on it. So a new set of legislators potentially could vote on it, and then it goes to the referendum. So it's not clear whether we'll get enough votes to have it on the ballot next year.
Okay, so it will come up for a vote in this session.
Absolutely.
But you don't know that it will.
I'm going to cough somewhere else.
I'm hopeful it will. I mean, the Senate has changed in its composition considerably in both the Democratic legislators and the Republican legislators, and so there's a good possibility that we could get to the necessary votes in the Senate this time. So I would say that's a possibility with even some bipartisanship, hopefully.
All right. Moving along to climate change, zero carbon future. In 2022, the state of Connecticut codified the goal of obtaining all the state's power from clean energy sources by 2040. The first question, what legislation, policies, or proposals do you suggest or support to achieve a state-mandated zero carbon future for Connecticut? And the other side, what legislation, policies, or proposals would you not support? Start with Senator Maher.
Okay, well, there is a lot out there, and I'm not going to read it all to you, but there are so many bills. As you just mentioned, by 2040, we're supposed to have zero carbon emissions. Some of the things that are out there, and one thing that I'll just talk about, the bill that I put in, that I'm talking to the Department of Energy, Environment, Energy Protection, DEEP, about, is composting. Because 30% of our landfill is vegetative waste. 30% is so much more dangerous because it is methane producing, and methane is 25% more dangerous than carbon dioxide. So we really want to make sure that we reduce the vegetative waste in our landfills. There are, I'm not going to get anaerobic or aerobic, I can't remember. Anaerobic?
Aerobic.
So we'll just leave it there, that some sort of aerobic, okay? There is a, and I'm so sorry, all of this, I like cramped, kind of like an exam, and I can't remember any of it. But it is in Connecticut, and we are trying to move the vegetative waste out of the landfills to this environmental thing. And I was talking with Katie Dykes, the head of DEEP, and she said we're looking at 850 tons eventually by the time we get everything going. And the reason this is so important is because there is no reason we should be putting vegetative waste into landfills. It's really bad. I mean, okay, I'm just gonna go on my soapbox. I've been composting in my backyard for 35 years, okay? And it is, I literally put out one bag of trash every week. Now that's just me, one person, but nonetheless, that's one bag of trash. None of that other stuff in there. So, not to get deep down this rabbit hole, that is one of the things that I'm absolutely supporting. The other thing that I am supporting is energy, making sure that we get a clean energy grid. And that is just incredibly important. So I'm looking at those bills as they're coming through and paying attention to them. Right now, I'm the chair of Children's, and Children's finishes by March 7th in terms of all their bills. So I have to admit my head's been deeply into Children's because as a chair, that's what you do. And so I haven't really been able to spend a ton of time, but there are so many acts out there. Carbon-free school requirements for new construction, promoting energy affordability, establishing a transportation carbon budget for the state, an act concerning revision to clean energy solutions. There's a lot of work in the legislature on all of this right now, but I'm going to stop because I'm starting to sound a little dumb here, so I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues. Oh, I turned it off, sorry.
That's okay, it gives them a moment to brace for my answer. So I would just add one more bill to the list. I introduced HB 5571, which would decrease the consumption of single-use plastic, but at the same time develop a robust industry to manufacture, market, and distribute here in the state viable, environmentally sound alternatives. So we can't do one thing without looking at the other, and I think that that's kind of where we're all starting to when we talk about introducing these kinds of bills that may seem radical to some, we're looking at how will it be sustainable even as we're introducing it. Now we're talking about, like, you're talking about what's going on in Children's right now, what we're all experiencing in our committees, is we're in the stage where we're really fleshing out what these bills will look like. So nothing that you see right now, if you go and you pull up HB 5571, you may not see much detail on that. You may not see much of anything other than really a statement of purpose. And this is what the hearing process, which we're really deep in the midst of right now, and then the committee meetings that follow, that's where the real meat gets kind of put back on the bones here. And then from that point, it could still change right up until the moment it is voted on or not, if it is even called to the floor. So these are the things that we want to try and focus as closely as we can on the end goal, which is why I think at this point it really has to include not just what do we want to get, but how do we want to get there and how will we be able to sustain it. And I think that that has been the change that I have seen just in 2 years in the way environmental and energy-related bills have been proposed. There's a real mind for sustainability.
Thank you. There's a lot going on as far as bills that are being proposed. Some of the things that the House was negotiating and talking about the other day is that most of our waste is shipped to Ohio into a landfill. And we've got to stop doing that. So we're trying to figure out how are we going to manage our waste for the future. So they're working on a bipartisan committee to try to get answers for this. There are bills that are coming down for example, reduced packaging, decreased waste. We want people who are producing and packaging things to use less. We want to recycle more. Right now, there's really no market for recycling, and we need to develop that, not only as a state, but as a nation. of course, we're working for new energy sources so that we can, for example, our Capitol building has its own energy plant, and it needs to be replaced. So I was out there the other day picketing with the environmentalists saying, Governor, you need to pay attention to this, if not to replace this with another carbon fuel, but maybe we should be heating the legislative office building in the Capitol with geothermal, and so we may need to take that building down and completely redo how, as an example, as to how we can get an entire campus off carbon fuels. One of the bills that I've become a little infamous about is a bill proposing human composting. It's a relatively new procedure for, instead of burial, instead of cremation, where you are actually put in with wood chips into a container and blown with warm moisture, and in 30 days you become a cubic yard of soil. It decreases our carbon footprint with gas. It protects, I know this is an off subject for us. And it means you're not putting toxic chemicals into the ground that can potentially lead into infiltration into your water supply. And you basically return what they say, dust to dust. And this is going through the environmental bill this year. I'm hoping that it passes. But it's just another way that we can look at as we as humans decide how are we going to sustain the planet. We've got to look at every single process that we use and figure out a better way to do it.
That off-topic remark got me going about Jewish funerals. Simple box, just simple wood box, just a shroud, no jewelry, and so it reminded me of my upbringing and my experience. But I think that all of these issues that have been talked about are really important. I served on the Environment Committee my first 4 years in office. I'm no longer on that committee, but I really learned a lot about the things that we can do. I know it was incredible. The very first year I was there, we passed a ban on single-use plastic bags, and everyone was like, there was a lot of testimony on that. People were up in arms that we couldn't make that change. There were all kinds of projected costs to making that change. And we moved incredibly quickly to this new model that had already been happening in other parts of the country and some of our cities, towns. And so I feel like we are resistant, but then sometimes we're just afraid of the change. But the change can be very positive. And, you know, I know most of us probably had to go out to our car many times to get our bags after we forgot them. But it really was pretty painless. I think that the bills that are there now for the packaging are really important. There are costs to it, and hopefully we can address how we mitigate against those costs. But I also think that there are opportunities, because there are the opportunities, as Ceci was talking about, and Aimee, to begin building new industries, green, friendly industries that our state can take a lead in and hopefully provide more jobs and good jobs. I did work this year on the working group. I chaired the working group for indoor air quality in our public schools. And there again, there's another opportunity. If we're going to be investing in new HVAC systems, we should be investing in systems that are as friendly as we can to the environment, and that's really important as well. So, and hopefully we'll be incentivizing some of that. And I was very pleased to see the governor, after the initial $150 million investment in that, just renewed that investment, and there's a $300 million commitment toward improving indoor air quality in our public schools. And that affects every town and city in Connecticut, somewhere, some way. That's something that's going to really make a difference.
Just as an aside, I use the recycling center to do recycling. Have I noticed just recently that they now have a place you can bring in vegetative waste? And you can now use the recycling center for vegetative waste in Ridgefield.
If I could just add to that, we're actually one of, I think, only 3 in the state right now that has a solar-powered composting right there within our own town. Right. We were there for the grand opening of the food pit, and it's really impressive. But also now, folks from other municipalities across the state are coming to visit it because of the way in which it was done. It was done with a lot of help from within the community. a lot of contributions from local businesses, but it's working. It's getting, I don't know what the latest statistics are, but I want to say it was getting to about 30% less of I think it was hitting the number we were worried about, with just the few number of people who know about it. So I think if we talk about it, tell your friends. It's such a great program that we're running.
So bravo to Ridgefield.
One other point about Ridgefield, I read about, I believe there's a company now in Ridgefield that will come and pick up your composting materials. And I don't know if they're still in existence, but I thought, what a great idea, because there are a lot of people who, is that you?
I can speak to that.
Oh, that's so great, because I was thinking I want to join, I want to get these.
Carlson, I'm a 20-year resident here in Ridgefield. Luckily, Rudy got me hired actually through the NIPS program. The fees is paying for my part-time salary. We are one of the 3 communities that is collecting food waste, and what makes us kind of unique is that we are composting it on site. So we're not trucking it to New Milford Farms or New England Farms. So curbside compost is the local business that will come to your home and pick it up. You don't want to bring it to the recycling center, so do tell your friends.
Two choices for vegetative waste. The last part of climate change. Do you support declaring a climate emergency to access additional federal funds? Starting with Representative Berger-Girvalo.
Yes.
Representative Dennis.
Yes, yeah, of course, anything we can do to bring more federal resources in to help us do this, we should do it.
Senator Kushner.
Yes, for those reasons, and also because I think we really need to elevate the awareness that we are in a crisis, and that we're not thinking very far into the future if we ignore it.
Senator Maher.
Absolutely. It makes sense, and we need to address this. I mean, if you talk to high school students and elementary school students, one of their, and even my children in their 30s, one of the biggest issues for youth is this existential threat of climate change. And it is, when we talk about children's mental health, which I mentioned I've been deeply in recently, this is part of it. If you can't see the world ahead of you, if you can't see the world existing, why? Why would we not declare a climate emergency? Number one, it supports our children understanding that we really care about their future. And secondly, why would we not access federal funds if we can?
Has legislation been submitted in this session to do that? Do you know? I actually didn't follow through and look that up.
So you wouldn't necessarily need to submit legislation to access those funds. There are multiple ways, depending upon what kinds of grants exist. And so it can come directly from the governor. It can come from Chris Murphy and Senator Blumenthal coming together and working with them. It can also come through committees. So the Environment Committee can work together with, because it is a joint committee with House and Senate.
I actually have some research on that. It is House Bill 6397, an act concerning zero carbon emissions. That is the bill that declares a climate emergency. And there is $7 billion nationally in competitive grants as part of the Zero Emissions Technologies Program, with a further $20 billion nationally in competitive grants as part of General Assistance and Low-Income and Disadvantaged Communities Program. So the EPA is still developing the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund program design, and the details are expected this summer.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to gun control. Both legislators and Governor Ned Lamont have indicated that they will submit legislation to strengthen the efforts to control gun violence in Connecticut. Two parts. Do you support strengthening efforts to control gun violence in Connecticut? What measures must any gun control legislation include? What measures would you not support or vote against? Starting with Representative Berger-Girvalo. I don't think you've gone first yet.
I'm not sure that I have, but here we go. Yes, I support strengthening. As far as what measures must exist in all, we're looking at a kind of a spectrum of opportunities that we need to be mindful of. So I don't think there's any one single thread that would follow through, except that it really has to be effective in controlling gun violence. I personally proposed HB 5525, which would appropriate funds to DPH for gun violence prevention, because we can legislate all we want. If we don't have the funds to do something about it, it ends up being meaningless. HB 5942, which would require secure storage of a firearm in a home at any time when not under immediate control of the owner of the firearm, regardless of who resides in the home. So right now, a single person who lives in their home by themselves does not have to lock up their gun. That's basically what it comes down to. HB 6151, which addresses ghost guns. So the purchase and possession and transfer of the components within guns that people can buy interchangeably and use to enhance their firearms. Folks can use those pieces to build a gun that has no registration number. This would require serial numbers on all of the parts. And we talk about what do we want to do to make these changes happen. Awareness is a huge part of this, but also understanding that when we are here in Connecticut, where we have it, we often hear Connecticut already has strong enough gun laws. If Connecticut has strong enough gun laws, then we're not seeing death by gun. And until we get to that point, I don't think that it's strong enough.
Representative Jen.
Thank you. Yes, the governor has supported or has proposed a few things, including banning assault-style weapons, ghost guns, which I would support. I did propose a bill that would require liability for anyone who had a gun that was used in a crime or a violent action, so that you would actually be held liable for any of the violence that had happened. I think part of our issue is that one, we have way too many guns in our country than what we really need. Secondly, we have a mental health crisis going on, and this is going to come up later in our discussion, in that COVID did not cause it, but COVID exposed it. And the mental health crisis in our country is overwhelming providers, it's overwhelming systems, it's overwhelming the country as a whole, and we haven't figured out a way to deal with it yet. And even if we wanted to deal with it, we don't have enough systems in place to take care of all the people who would want access. So part of it has to be education, it has to be reaching out for people in their mental health. In their daily checkups, when you should go to the doctor, one of the questions they should ask you is about your mental health. Are you feeling depressed? Are you frustrated? Are you finding gainful meaning at work? Are there things that you find that you're lashing out at? And we're not there yet, but we need to move towards those means.
Thank you. I too support the measures that are before us already in the legislature. I think that there are many things we can do. One of the important things we did last year, and I would like to see continued, is we gave funding to grassroots organizations that are on the ground and actually working in our urban communities particularly to intervene and to prevent gun violence. And so we heard a lot of testimony last year from long-term organizations like non-profit longevity, and we decided that we needed to fund these community groups that are intervening. For instance, if there is active gun violence, gang violence, what typically happens is it escalates because then there's revenge that's sought, and folks go in and actually intervene and say, talk folks down from getting, furthering the violent acts. And so I think that it's really important that we do all of these measures, but also make sure that we're getting resources to the ground level where folks are intervening and really confronting gun violence. I particularly am interested too in making sure that we are banning guns from all of our college campuses, something that we haven't done yet in Connecticut, and I think that would be important to add to these measures, as well as the ghost gun and some of the other things that have been mentioned.
Okay,
Okay, so I'm not gonna go, I'll just say the things that I believe in, banning ghost guns, changing our carry permit laws, assault weapon ban, and the community violence reduction, preventing future and retaliatory violence. And that work is already, as Julie mentioned, already happening, and that was funded this past year, and we need to keep that going because that is such a huge part of inner city violence. And there is another bill out there right now, which I think was, I think it has been introduced before. It's the ammunition tax, so that there is a tax on ammunition. It did not pass last time, so it's up again this year, so I'm watching that as well.
There's one other measure that I've heard about that I haven't followed closely, but that would limit the number of guns that can be purchased in a month. And there's been a lot of studies done that show that much of what we see in terms of gun violence is a result of guns that were purchased in bulk. And so somebody is absolutely circumventing the system and selling those, buying in bulk and then selling off to folks who shouldn't have guns in the first place. So I think that's another measure that could bring down some of the gun violence risk.
I know that Governor Lamont has made suggestions. I think they were in 3 different proposals. I'll just read what his proposal is: requiring a 10-day waiting period before purchasing a firearm, increasing education requirements for firearm licenses, requiring safe storage regardless of who lives at a given residence, improving the design safety standards for semi-automatic handguns, making commission of a family violence crime or being a fugitive an automatic disqualifier for holding a pistol permit, prohibiting the carry of any loaded long gun in a vehicle, requiring trigger locks for all firearm purchases, investing an additional $2.5 million in community violence intervention programs, banning the open carrying of firearms in public while continuing to allow concealed carry with permit except in particular locations, limiting handgun purchases to 1 per month to discourage straw purchases, closing loopholes in the state's assault weapons ban, strengthening penalties related to the state's ban on large capacity magazines to make the ban enforceable, and increasing the age to purchase all firearms to 21. So this is the governor.
Could I just add one more piece to
Of
this?
course.
I have 1 child in college, 1 child in high school, and my youngest was in 1st grade when Sandy Hook happened, and that was when we introduced very regular lockdown drills for our children. So at that point in time, we didn't ask much to change for gun owners, but we asked for everything to change for our children. And my children have both expressed to me in response to the latest mass shooting in school, which is not our biggest problem, highest numbers of gun violence, but it is a tremendous problem and one that other countries do not have. Both of my children expressed that they had never walked into school since Sandy Hook and not thought, never walked into school and not thought, maybe today is the day that there's an active shooter in my school. And I worked in Ridgefield. I worked in a 1st grade classroom the year after Sandy Hook. These children know what they're hiding from. They know it's not a deer, maybe run, whether because they've been told by older siblings, kids on the bus, whatever it is. The fear that these kids, and this speaks to the mental health thing that we're talking about, we have done our children wrong. And it is time to fix that so that the next kids coming through elementary school don't have to grow up the way our kids have.
Yes, absolutely, 110% what Aimee just said. And when we look at increasing access to Keith's point about mental health also, and the impact of trying to get to a provider and not being able to because there aren't enough. This issue of gun violence in our classrooms and the impact that it has on children and their mental health, there are a lot of different reasons we have mental health issues. This is a huge part of it, and we aren't looking at it. So yes, the pandemic had an impact. yes, technology has an impact, but gun violence and these lockdown drills and the fact that it is a consistent issue across our nation of having guns in classrooms and shootings, it's become so normalized that we don't even hear about them all anymore. This is not acceptable. It's not acceptable in our communities, it's not acceptable in our state, and it's not acceptable in our nation. So the fact that we are trying to continue to push Connecticut forward, I only wish that other states would try to do the same.
At this point, I'm going to break from asking the lead questions and turn it over to you who are in attendance today.
I'm going to borrow a microphone.
I'll take this one.
The buzzy. If you would all stand in line, that's the easiest way for us to do it. If you just stand in line and we can get it done quickly. Again, I want to remind everyone we're closing at 11:30, so please do not make this a personal issue. If you have a personal issue, I'm sure the legislators would be happy to talk to you offline. So let's start. And give us your name and where you're from.
Howard Aimee in Ridgefield. The question I had, or the point I wanted to make was about climate change and how most every homeowner in this region has to convert from fossil fuels to renewable, right? So I went through that process last year, and my takeaway was, yes, there's lots of funds that have been put together, isn't that wonderful? However, it's too complicated. And what is needed, one of the assumptions of the theory of the competition is perfect information. That's critical right now. And it's not there, it's too hard, people are not going to do it, it's too hard, and it's expensive, right? So there's a lot of money involved. So without better information that you can rely on, as opposed to fast talking, salespeople, they ain't gonna happen. Is my point, and that goes for composting. So I haven't heard of anything being done about that, and that to me is the big barrier.
Did you have a question?
Well, what are we doing about information solving for that? Because that's the big barrier.
So you bring up a point that I think that we have all expressed our own frustration with, and that is continuity across agencies, across agency communication. And in fact, just yesterday, a member of our community emailed Deep about some funding that was passed in 2019, and the website still reflected 2018's information. Not only did he get a reply within an hour and a half from the agency, also copying me, which I thought was brave, but also a commitment to fixing all of the details on there. Now we just put some money, a lot of money actually, into streamlining a lot of the processes in the last session, fixing the online access to these kinds of things. I think that if we all, and I can't believe I'm going to say this out loud because this is the greatest joke, how difficult it is to get anything done at the DMV. I think if all of the agencies followed the model that our DMV has implemented in the last few years, we would do so much better, and that includes accessing information, accessing grant money, accessing whatever sort of environmental pieces that you're talking about. So that is something that is on legislators' minds, and it is something that we are absolutely mindful of, and I am hopeful that as a caucus, it's something that we're going to address again this year. I haven't seen anything specific, but we are all very, very aware of how difficult it is to jump through all of those hoops.
So just one last, because Howard, we talked about this last year, I remember you telling me all about your experience. One of the things is, you can go on Energize CT and it will tell you, I know, it's rudimentary at best, okay? And I think that what we're experiencing right now, as I think Julie mentioned, all of a sudden we've gone from almost 0 to 60 on wanting to make all these changes, and we don't have the processes written and ways of making it easier for consumers. So as Aimee said, we are aware of that and working on it, so thank you.
Does it, all the funds in the world come either don't help enough unless people know what the heck it is they're doing.
100%, thank you.
Do you have a suggestion? If you, maybe you should
Well,
write up your suggestion
I
and,
mean, you need a centralized place where people can go for information and get help, like you can get an energy audit, you can get a home energy
On
audit.
Energize
For the purpose
CT,
of
you can
how
go
do
there.
How should my house, my home be dealt with in terms of, and going renewable, right, going green? What would I do? What could you do? What would the effect be? You can't, it's really hard to figure out and what's available, what it would actually do with it. It's really, you have to make a lot of educated guesses. And the information is sparse, there's a lot of technical issues that people can get it. So you need some source to go to, a go-to place where someone can actually help you.
so
Which is
energize
not
CT.
simple. Maybe
what-
the
it's the
industry
beginning.
can help fund it. For example, the people who are installing the system can help fund it a little bit instead of them having to spend the money. So that might be a
So
good
for those of you who are interested, Energize CT is a place to start. Okay,
It's hard.
okay. Sir, next question.
Name?
I'm John Lee, Ridgefield resident for a long time. Actually, I was a resident when I was 2, and then I moved to Canterbury. Came back to the Ridgefield. My main thing is I have actually, as my friend here had experienced, going to renewables. And I want to just say that there's people need to talk. HVAC is the wrong word. Heat pump is the right word, okay? Heat pumps are amazing. 30% less total amount of energy actually used. Mine worked great last night and worked great when it was freezing cold out. Which we had a couple of really nasty ones this winter. And I just want to say that, the system he's talking about getting, rebates or whatever. I've made money by changing to a heat pump. We should be doing heat pumps in all of our schools, in all our government buildings. I shouldn't see in the newspaper them talking about a heating system for Bethel or any place that isn't like, whoa, full stop, do a heat pump. So that's my thing.
So we talked about this last year also, John, and I agree with you because I have a heat pump, and when it was that 0 degree or minus day, I had the heat pump on in one part of the house, and it reduced my oil consumption for that day. So I didn't hear the furnace continuing to go on. What heat pumps do, for those who don't know about them, and there are rebates coming through this green legislation that was passed this summer. Heat pumps basically, and I'm not going to, John, you're the scientist, but it uses transfers the energy from the cold and the water, and you can use them in cold and you can also use them in hot. And they are really energy efficient. Did I get that right, Howard? Okay, so yes, I hear you, definitely. And does anybody else have any?
I think we should probably.
I think you ready
Should we move on? Okay.
Heat pumps and Energize Connect.
Hi, I'm Wyatt, and our family lives in Branchville. And I was hoping that you could speak a little bit to the educational priorities that are reflected or perhaps not reflected in bills this legislative session, and particularly K through 12, some of the education gaps, learning gaps that have emerged during COVID-19. And you touched a little bit upon social, emotional, mental health challenges that students may be facing coming out of this period. Are there resources and policies that are under discussion to specifically address that learning gap and some of those challenges?
So I do serve on the education committee, and there are a multitude of bills coming out that we're attempting to address these questions, but it's really complicated and difficult. I think the main bill that's being pushed is 5003, which is a bill that would do many things. Probably the most important thing is that it would speed up the ECS funding so that instead of phasing in through 2028, it would go into 100% immediately. I know that for many of the towns, Ridgefield and other towns, that's not going to address some of your needs because it's not going to be an infusion of money, but it is in some of the bigger districts, including Danbury, a significant amount of money that would go to the schools. But I think part of the problem is that our schools during the last couple of years have used ARPA funding to try and address these issues, and that money is going to disappear. And so we're going to be confronted with a greater need. And I mean, in the governor's budget, it's basically level funding for schools, and I think that's a problem. And so as a legislature, we're trying to deal with it, but there's not a lot of room in the budget to really address all the multitude of issues where we need additional funding, whether it's higher education, nonprofits, childcare. It's just, there are so many areas today where we need to really increase spending in Connecticut. And because of the structure of our budgeting, which was done to, keep us healthy and sound financially as a state, it still is very limiting in terms of how much money we can spend, even at a time when we have a surplus. So I'm on appropriations as well, and I serve on 3 of the subcommittees for education. And so we're all struggling with those issues right now.
Any other comments?
Well, just a quick one on mental health, the issue of social emotional and mental health. We are working to address that in the SB2, which is the Senate bill that is coming out of children's, and we're looking at increasing access to social workers, mental health professionals, but also increasing certification. How can we get people taught, ramped up, and out there in the communities as well? And we're looking at not just their mental health, but also increasing physical health. So school-based health centers, and also putting in place, this is an Office of Behavioral Health Advocate, because we have a health advocate, but we're looking at a behavioral health advocate. And that is going to be an ombudsman who actually is going to help address as you move through systems and increasing access. So there's a lot of things out there, and just as a point of order, there were 4,000 bills put in this year, and they're all weaning their way down into being the final bills. So there's a lot out there that we don't know yet how they're going to come out.
Next question, please.
Hello, my name is Jem Sutler, and I moved to Danbury about a year and a half ago from Chappaqua. And I was on the committee, the environmental committee, and I learned a lot. And one of the things that was helpful was that each town had a committee to help, so that people would learn more about what was happening. And actually, Chappaqua became certified as a green community. So they had to get all kinds of loans or whatever it is, access grants to have certain things working. And so now that's what they're known as, and that's really great. But I don't see that much here in Connecticut. And one of my reasons for attending today was to learn more about Connecticut and what's going on here. I am a social worker and a teacher, so I have both of that. I'm retired at the moment. Maybe I'll come out of retirement. Anyway, so there were a couple of things that I thought of. One was the gun violence, and I also thought, you're doing great stuff. What about working with the, police officers and helping them, be sensitive to the issues, mental health issues. When I'm standing in line, I'm forgetting in Danbury, there's a new concern. This is something maybe I'll take up with the person in charge of Danbury. I think that's you, Julie, right? But it's the Clancy project, which we don't have to go into now. But I'm very worried about that because, from a personal issue, I came from a solar house, I composted my backyard just like you did, and to be living in, number one, a community on that Rivington. So it's hard to compost there and to get that system going where we could get maybe these townhouses, communities, and apartment dwellings people, that they could learn, maybe they could get somebody to pick up their burdens or whatever. That would be great. And, okay, I don't want to talk too much time.
Just a couple of quick things. I do believe that, and you can confirm this for me, but I think I read that the Ridgefield composting company will pick up in Danbury, I believe.
I believe he does cover that.
Yeah, so I know, I live right on the other side of the hill from Rivington, so I'm on Ridgefield Road. And so I was thinking the same thing. I'd like to get in touch about that. I want to say to the folks that are talking about the difficulty about converting to renewable energy, I'm totally with you on that. We've been trying to figure that out at our house, and it's a full-time job, and neither my husband and I both can't do that. In terms of the Clancy project, it isn't just a Danbury issue, and I've talked to Rudy about this because it is really going to impact, if it goes through, it will impact all of northern Ridgefield and even maybe more, because we're talking, that's a project that they're trying to build on Sawmill, right as you get to exit 1 on 84, and it's a huge terminal. It will be a huge, they're saying a warehouse, but it really is a truck terminal. They could have as many as 90 trucks a day going in and out. And so for people who live in the northern part of Ridgefield and go to the highway, it could be very, very difficult traffic-wise. For people who live closer, and that includes people in Ridgefield, because it's really close to Turner Road, there is going to be the additional problem of diesel fuel emissions and potentially some problems in terms of the environmental impact on our water. So there's a lot of issues there. I've been following it really closely, meeting with the leaders who are standing in opposition from Rivington. And I do believe the new application, if it wasn't filed this week, it will be filed next week. So they're still intending to go forward, unfortunately. So, but anybody who's interested in that, definitely get in touch with me.
Any other comments from the residents? Okay, next question, please.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Patrice Gillespie, and I represent something called the Connecticut Energy Network. That's a group of groups, the member groups being local energy committees and sustainability teams. One such stellar team is the Ridgefield Action Committee for the Environment. And because in many dozens of towns, these groups, these task forces and sustainability teams get involved every 10 years in the development of their town's plan of conservation and development. And I know from my own experience that there is much time and treasure spent on the development of these documents. And unfortunately, there's a lot of reinventing of wheels, right? Every town is struggling to incorporate new information about climate change and energy resilience. So wouldn't it be nice if there was a state level document that would provide exemplary material that could be emulated at the local level and even by the COGS? Unfortunately, the current state plan of conservation and development does not provide any such guidance. I mean, basically, the plan, which was written in 2017, basically says beware of climate change. Okay, that's not a plan. Basically, it says beware of sea level rise, and think about renewables. So there's the next plan of conservation and development at the state level is being undertaken now by the Office of Policy and Management. And we are hoping to persuade state-level people to really take time and develop actionable, meaningful, measurable steps that would help these towns develop a much better plan for themselves. House Bill 6647 has been put forth by the Planning and Development Committee, but it basically addresses just the timeline of adoption of this document. What we're interested in is not so much the timeline, but the content. So we have been advocating for the addition of a 7th chapter, if you will, to the state plan that would be exclusively developed, dedicated to climate change and energy resilience. We're not sure we're going to be successful, but we are going to try and amend House Bill 6647 that would inspire greater content, meaningful content to the state plan. So I'm hoping that you will help us amend and revise 6647 so that the next plan actually serves as exemplary for lesser jurisdictions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I just want to highlight how important it is for conversations like that to happen and to include all of us, because if you can do that, you're going to advocate for this very important thing. If we can advocate side by side, if we can advocate sort of adjacently, or even on part of another conversation, we have these conversations with the chairs of these committees all of the time. The House Chair, full disclosure, the House Chair of Planning and Development is my closest friend in the entire legislature, and possibly on the planet at this point, because we spend so much time together. But those are the kinds of relationships, and I don't mean to say that we exploit those relationships, but we build really strong relationships with one another, and we're able to really bring those kinds of requests. And the stuff that comes directly from our constituents is the stuff that is easiest to defend when it comes time to testify for or against legislation, because we have the people behind us saying, this is what we want, this is what we elected you for. So please make sure, and this goes for everybody in the room, if you ever have something like this that you want to move forward, make sure that you let us know before we get to that hearing process, the committee meeting process, so that even if it's something that we're not part of in terms of the committee itself, we can at least have some sort of input and advocacy for you on your behalf.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments from the legislators? Okay, next question, please.
Hi, my name is Tom Barber. I appreciate everything you do. People like you and Rudy. Anyway, what you do, I really appreciate it. I think it's great for service for all of us. I just want to bring up something about, I guess it would be sort of related to NIMBYism and moving towards a green society, which we need to do, all of us for the planet. I think you need to create a procedure, legislative, legal, procedural, that balances off individual rights with, frankly, greater rights in society as a whole, moving towards that green society. Because if we don't do that, whether it's expanding the electrical grid and other areas in which we need to move towards that new economy, towards that new way of creating and using energy, which basically runs our society, runs the world, I don't think we're going to get there. And so I'm wondering if there's something that's being done right now within the government in Hartford to start at least thinking about that, because there are a lot of issues there, a lot of individual rights issues, which are very well defined, and there are a lot of societal issues which aren't as well defined, but will need to be, for legal reasons, if nothing else.
Yeah, I want to talk, that's a great question. And as far as our conversion, we're going to take, this is going to be very painful. And I hate to be the one who brings bad news. But the next 10 to 20 years is going to be a very painful, expensive conversion for our nation and our world to get off fossil fuels. And not everybody's there yet, but more people are there today than were there yesterday. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, the amount of money that's coming in to help move us towards that greener economy, which hasn't even made it into the pipeline yet, is going to move that forward. But your discussion about, and I'm going to step on the third rail of Connecticut politics, which is affordable housing. We have 100,000 people for jobs. They want, in our state right now, we could fill 100,000 jobs. We don't have the vacancy in housing for those people to come and live here. We have, on average, a 3% vacancy rate. In Fairfield County, it's a 1.5% vacancy rate. We can't get teachers to come here because they can't afford to live here. We can't get nurses. We're educating our youth so they can leave the state, not because they can't get a job, but because they can't afford a place to live. And so we have to figure this out as far as what do we want to be as Connecticut? If we want to be towns where we have 2 acres at 4 acre zoning, whatever zoning you want, you're going to have to come to the realization that when your taxes are never going to go down because your grand is always going to go up or stay the same, but your expenses are always going to go up. And we're not going to have the youth moving into our area because they don't have the income to come here, which means we're going to go into stagnation and deflation. And so we have to think about this, and the state is trying to work on this regional, we're trying to figure out how do we get higher density housing in areas near our transportation systems so that we can go towards a mass transit system, so that we can actually move people around the state faster. Like, you know, I'm a half mile from the Cannondale train station. If I wanted to get to Hartford, it would take me 5 hours to get there, which is an absolute absurdity when we live near a mass transit system. That is not a mass transit system, that's a Disney ride. And so we need to figure out how we're going to reinvent ourselves as a state and what we want to become. And so you're going to see more of this coming up. But understand, we are not keeping people in our state because when they get older, they can't afford the taxes. And when they get younger, they can't afford the houses. So we're ending up in a situation, and don't think it's just the small towns that are like this. It's the big towns. They don't want higher density housing either. Everybody's you talk about this NIMBYism. And so we're going to have to come together as the state, as individuals, and figure out where are the places that we can make people happy, give them the infrastructure, the schools, the needs that they want with health care, transportation, affordability, so that they can stay in the state and provide the services that we need. If we don't address this seriously, we're not going to go forward anywhere. And so that's just my take on the NIMBYism for individual rights versus social rights and how we're going to balance that in the future.
Okay, we just have about 10 minutes, so we have 2 more questioners. So if we can keep it to as brief as possible.
Good morning. Thank you very much for serving all of us so well in Hartford. My question has to do with a top topic for all of us, which is the increase nationwide in Connecticut as well of various kinds of hate crimes, just different peoples that are being attacked for different reasons. It can be religious, it can be their sexual orientation, and so on. Before the legislature on some of these issues and ways to address them.
I think that would be on the Judiciary Committee, and I think I've seen something about that, Angela, but I don't recall it right now. I'm not on that committee. I don't know if anybody here is.
I'm on the committee, but we're still waiting for bills to come out to committee. So they're still screening, and we haven't seen it yet. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just haven't. Does anybody else have anything?
I did see that there was there was a bill. I don't know. I have no idea what the details were, but there were at least 3 hate crimes bills that were introduced by some of our colleagues. It is definitely something that we are super mindful of, this answer to you, and I can't find you. I have 2 sets of glasses. I can see all of you. Really well. It is definitely something that we're talking about all the time, and the heightened harassment that folks have to deal with every day. I stopped posting any social media for quite some time because there was someone who was targeting my posts with anti-trans, despicable anti-trans language and sentiments. And there are 4 members of our community who are teenage trans kids who have worked very closely with me in my campaign and in following my legislation, and I just couldn't stomach the idea of them seeing these horrible, hateful words. So it is certainly something that we have to deal with, and we have to deal with it immediately.
Next question, please.
I'd like to, I'd like to talk a little bit about the windfall provision for teachers that prevent us from accessing our Social Security benefits. We have full clock. It really is an inhibitor to getting teachers into Connecticut, and I'd like that to be addressed. I think something came up during this last session about that did not pass. If you could address that.
Yeah, I've been just working on that this week, actually, but unfortunately, that is a federal requirement, and what has come to my attention is there was a discussion about having a resolution passed that would support our federal delegation. There are efforts in Congress now to change that. So what happens is teachers and other public employees are not covered by Social Security, and if you take a job as a teacher, for instance, and you have had previous service in the private sector, when you become a teacher, you can no longer access your Social Security that you earned while you were working in the private sector.
Or your spouse.
And your spouse cannot, or your spouses and your spouse cannot. So it's a real serious issue. It's something that's been in place for a long time. I think it was in the late 60s. And someone approached me from the Association of Retired Teachers just this week to see if we could pass a resolution in the state urging that this be changed at the federal level. I just found out that it has to go through the same procedures as any proposed bill, and the deadline's passed in January, and so we're not able to do that this year. I have indicated that I will support that and put that forward next year. But I need to be reminded in January, and that person assured me he would. And so, I mean, I think we'll try and address it, but it is a real inhibitor, as you said. I mean, one of the great resources we could have right now to address our shortage of teachers is to attract people who want to leave private industry, who maybe were teachers and want to go back to teaching, but in the interim had some, private job. So all of that is lost to us because people find it as such a deterrent because they don't want to lose their Social Security, and it is a real crisis. So I hope that it's something that will be dealt with on a federal level.
My pension windfall is $20,000 a year. It's like nothing.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Did you hear all our gasps in the room when we all learned for the first time about this?
My name is Caroline. I'm a British subject and I'm a American citizen, and my question is about real gun control in this country. Until you ban assault weapons and ban many guns, you're never going to stop the violence. The Second Amendment never intended that everybody could own a gun. It was there to implement the fact that a militia could be armed if necessary. Okay, let's go on. I'm sorry, no. So that's my question is, please, cannot our legislators get real gun control and actually ban some guns? Nobody needs to own a gun. I come from a country where people don't own guns, except maybe for sport, and they're housed in a special building and locked. So that's my worry about living in this country. I've been here now for several years, and that is my biggest concern about what's necessary here to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments?
Just, I don't see anybody about this dais disagreeing with you on the need for that kind of legislation. I know that we've done as much, I think, as could have been done in the moment in Connecticut, and we're aware that wasn't enough.
And I'll just add, it's really a national crisis, and it is a real serious issue. And there are many states in our country, I come from the Midwest, where it's just built into the culture. And I don't disagree with you. I think that even if we as Connecticut could accomplish that, I think that it would not solve the problem. It really is a national issue. And you've seen what's happened in our Congress. I mean, we actually have people advocating for bringing guns into our federal buildings and into our Congress. I can't, we're not in a good place nationally on this, and it's frightening.
We actually had someone propose a bill in a federal bill to make the AR the national gun, which is
Any other questions? We are coming upon 3 minutes left until 11:30. Any other questions? I have one left, but it will probably, your answers will take 3 minutes, so you'll hear from me again. But anyhow, I want to thank you all very much for coming. I thank our legislators for being open and willing to sit with us and listen and give their perspective, give their information about what's going on at the state legislature, and answering your questions. If you go to the Connecticut General Assembly's website, you can actually ask for what bills. There is a question box under cga.ct.gov, and you could find out what legislation on any particular subject has been introduced. You can find out a lot of information. You can find out, you can send emails to each of your legislators. Also, another place to go is the Connecticut Network, ct.n.com. And they provide access to hearings. I watched the Government Administration and Elections Committee public hearing on Wednesday morning when they were taking all the testimony about the 2 bills. I asked about right at the beginning, the absentee ballot, and they talked about the time frame for early voting in Connecticut. So that's another resource you have online. You can sit in your home in your pajamas and you can see what's going on at the state legislature. You can contact our legislators. I thank them all for their openness and their willingness